progressive left across the so-called civilized world has targeted Down syndrome babies for extinction at the hands of selective abortion. Those allowed to live, however, are now being co-opted in the left's own relentless quest to unmake biological gender. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello everyone, we're wrapping up back to school week on the only show that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. All week we've been giving shout outs to our students at FreedomProject Academy who have kicked off their new school year. Here's to classical education. All right, today we're going to be looking at a white privilege survey given to Colorado teachers, plus a clinical counselor says Drag Queen Story Hour is, quote, the greatest grooming program ever devised. But we kick things off with a really disturbing trend headed to the United States. The exploitation of those with Down syndrome performing in drag shows. At a public art event in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was scheduled for next month, was set to feature men and women with Down syndrome performing as drag queens and drag kings. A drag group known as, and this is kind of insulting to me, Drag Syndrome. Literally called Drag Syndrome. Does that mean that here's another way you could read that the drag queens themselves are syndrome, right? Some kind of a sickness or an illness or a dysfunction. A drag group known as Drag Syndrome is comprised of performers with Down syndrome and surprise, LGBT activist attempts to promote so-called inclusion. So the same lefties who don't want to include Down syndrome babies in the living world, right? Now want to include them, the ones that did make it out of the womb. And I mentioned this, if you aren't aware of this, check these numbers. A couple years back, you had Iceland bragging that 100% of Down syndrome babies that had been conceived in the womb had been successfully aborted. France was boasting like 95%. Denmark was boasting in the 90s. We've gotten rid of them. Once a baby is conceived Down syndrome, or even has a regular possibility of being Down syndrome, we've aborted them all. And yet, once they're born, let's take advantage of them. If we can't get rid of them, let's co-opt them to our causes.
Let's dress them up and put them on stage and clap and hoot and holler for them. That's what they're doing. And this actually started across the seas, and now it's coming into Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, not LA, not New York City, the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so the performances of this drag syndrome would feature song and dance by men wearing women's dresses, garish makeup, wigs, and in some cases, fake breasts. Women will sport beards and have men's clothing. And a local TV channel, Wood TV, reported that some people may be concerned because people with Down syndrome have limited mental capacity, that they might not have the ability to actually decide to take part or understand actually what is happening. So that got brought to people's attention. And other people are claiming, this is just another hollow gesture from the LGBT community to show just how accepting and inclusive they are and how woke they are.
Again, this is not about accepting anything. This is about undermining gender. This is about doing away with the concept that there is male and female. And I'll go one step further here. Why would we expect anything else from these organizations? These are the same organizations who are willing to exploit and utilize children who have not developed the mental capacity to decide for themselves. And so if you have no problem taking 6 and 7-year-old boys and having them dance in costume at bars where they're being hooted at by adult gay men, if you have no problem with that, you're going to have no problem with dragging, literally, no pun intended, Down syndrome people into this as well.
Yes, but I think the quote I'm about to read reveals how discriminatory they actually are. The event organizer, Jill Vinn of DisArt, D-I-S, like disability, art. DisArt, a Grand Rapids organization, connects people with art, people with disabilities with art.
Is it disability art, or are they dissing art?
Ooh.
Is it
twisting of the words?
Is
here.
it drag syndrome? Right? Do these liberals even know? Do they have a sense of irony? Probably not.
Irony. Okay, anyway, Jill Vinn said, we sought them out, so those with Down syndrome, we sought them out because they are at the very highest level of disability drag.
So the idea of inclusion here is inclusion by force, by compulsion.
And since you mentioned irony, let's talk about actually what has happened in the time since they announced that they would be doing this. The venue owner has actually, where this drag show would take place, has actually turned away the show because of exploitation concerns.
Peter Meyer, yeah, and this is an interesting thing because he's a rich man running for Congress. He is a Republican candidate for Congress, Pete Meyer. One of his properties is Tanglefoot Facilities, where you can host these kinds of things. And this group was going to, this Down syndrome drag show was going to would perform there. And then people started reacting about this. People, good-minded people pointed out that this is exploitation, right? What are we doing here? Is this the kind of attitude we want to take? And Mr. Meyer actually, after very carefully, I really appreciate, I'll let you read some of it, really appreciate his response.
He said, the differently abled are among the most special souls in our community, and I believe they, like children and other vulnerable populations, should be protected. This is not a decision I arrived at lightly. As the true nature of drag syndrome's performance became clear, I consulted with various relevant communities to ensure my decision was made as free of personal bias as possible. He says, I spoke with parents of the differently abled, people who had family members with Down syndrome, and members of the LGBTQ and artist community. In nearly every conversation, concerns were raised about the potential exploitation of the vulnerable.
Yeah, I think we're really well done. Good for you, Mr. Meyer. I'd love to see you in Congress. I hope you get elected. As the article points out, and I think this is a good quote from the article, quote, exploitation aside, drag is not art. It is the hypersexualized mockery of women, a sort of gender blackface on stage. Right. For white people, even accomplished funny comedians, to go back to Jimmy Durante or moving forward, to dress in blackface is now a non-starter. You are always going to be a racist no matter what reason you do it for. And yet, men garishly imitating women doesn't bother anybody. The hypocrisy is pretty astounding.
All right, and so we know that drag is not art like they are saying, but it is hypersexualized, and that's what they're doing in our libraries as well, where we're at the point now, we've been talking for months and months about this, about, having these drag queens come in and do story hour for our children, our little, most vulnerable children. And now we're to the point where we can't even agree if those who come into our library and are reading these children, we should do background checks to make sure they're not sex offenders. Or
if they are sex offenders, does that necessarily prohibit them from talking to our children?
And we have a specific case happening in Wichita, Kansas. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say it again. It's in Wichita, Kansas. This is not happening in California. This is not happening in New York or any of the big states. This is happening in Wichita, Kansas, where the library board had a meeting and they were asking the question, should there be background checks on drag queens who want to read to our children in the public libraries? And this question actually became inspired because of a drag queen reading event they did in downtown Wichita, which had about 220 people, they said, of adults and innocent children. And here's some video footage from that event.
This program was planned as part of an effort to have more inclusive programming at the library.
One cupcake and one slice of watermelon. That night, he had a stomach ache.
So what they did now, that event was months ago, but at the library board meeting they just had, there was actually a split between the board members of proposals whether or not that there should be a complete ban of drag queens who have to be on the sexual offenders list, and split between those who think, maybe the staff should have, quote, leeway in deciding whether these sex offenders should be allowed to do drag in front of our children.
Yeah, and you're going to trust the library staff to make this call. The radicalized left wing, let's get rid of books, let's undermine Western values, let's bring these drag queens in anyway. That library staff is going to decide?
At least for the Wichita library system, this specific one, and this is not true across the board, library director Cynthia Berner actually said that allowing sex offenders to present to children would be a non-starter for her and her staff. So good. She's actually doing good. Yep. But she said it might be okay to include a former sex offender in an adults-only discussion about the criminal justice system. So at least she doesn't want, I guess, to the children, but she's still like, maybe. So
I go back to I've said this many times, I go back to it. What's the purpose of this? Kids go to libraries to learn to read. Libraries are all about literacy. There's really no other function for them. The degree to which libraries now consider themselves part of the woke community of public services that have to be catering to very, very specific groups of people like drag queens is absurd. And why is it somehow better to have a drag queen read a story to a bunch of kids than anybody else? And as I've mentioned before, drag queens are extremists. They're grotesque parodies of women. They're not transgender. They are not gay necessarily. These are not performances that are specifically gay or transgender. These are not everyday working people going about their business. What you want to do is you want to normalize kids being read to by people of different genders or different sexualities. Why go to the clown show here?
Really what's happening is you are bringing in clowns.
It's a clown show.
Makeup, some of the makeup they use is actually meant to be for clowns. And so clowns tend to scare children. Some kids are like, ooh, bright colors. Other kids are horrified by clowns. And yet this is what you're doing. And this is supposed to encourage kids to read. It's going to just mortify them.
And think about what the reaction would be is if you invited a bunch of male clowns dressed as males dressed as male clowns who are all sex offenders to come to read to a kindergarten classroom. Do you understand that the same people now who think this is so wonderful and progressive would be freaking the boot out over this?
Well, you saw it in the video. You saw how excited some of these parents were, and the kids are like, because the kids don't know any better, and the parents are like, yay.
Yeah, you bring the clown guy from It, right?
No.
And give him a sexual perv record. And then let them read to your kids and see how you like it. And by the way, what exactly are you accomplishing here? What is your purpose?
Just so we know, there was no official decision made at the Wichita for the library board because they were split. So the board is sending the policy back to their operations committee for further revision to see whether or not sex offenders should be allowed to dress in drag. Can we just say that one more time?
Let me repeat that again. We can't even decide to keep sexual predators of little children away from little kids in the new progressive utopia.
Which makes perfect sense because the Drag Queen Story Hour is, quote, the greatest grooming program ever devised. And this is coming not just from you, it's not coming from me, it's from an actual licensed counselor. John Euler, a licensed professional counselor who has worked clinically with approximately 4,000 serial
predators. That does not mean they attack boxes of Special K. It means they are repeat, nasty serial offenders of little children.
He's been doing this for over 11 years, and he said he believes that the Drag Queen Story Hour actually constitutes, again, the greatest grooming program ever devised, and that these predators, these serial predators, are laughing all the way to the bank.
And in case you don't know, and I know you do, but in case you don't, we may have a liberal listening. Grooming means the process whereby you cultivate relationships with very vulnerable children that then become exploited sexually, right? In the same way that Down syndrome people are being exploited by this drag syndrome, right? And so grooming here is how pedophiles that's just an alternate sexuality. How sexual predators deal with children. And to groom them here, he's exactly right about this. These drag queen shows are perhaps the single greatest under-the-radar grooming program ever enhanced. It does exactly what the groomers do, but the parents now are bringing, the American public libraries are hosting them, and parents are dragging their kids to this stuff, right? I mean, dragging. It's imagine being a pedophile and then finding a way to get parents to drop their young children off in your dank basement or your windowless white van and say, we'll be back in 2 hours to get them. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening here.
This is exactly it. And Euler, I like this, and you've said it before. The question is, why are these men dressed in women's underwear and drag wanting greater access to the children? Why is that they're doing that?
Remember that Yaniv clown from Canada? The transgender guy who's suing the girls who won't wax, the women who won't wax his testicles.
Jessica Yaniv, yes.
Jessica Yaniv. And this is the same person who made the argument, right? That she wants to host a topless swimming party with 11 and 12-year-old girls. That's his ambition. He wants to be part of a topless swimming party with preteen girls. And you ask the right question. What exactly is this accomplishing?
Yeah, and Euler goes on. He says, because predators can calculate that the public senses something off-putting about them, and we say they're wise to that, they manipulate perceptions about what they're really doing. Again, he's been engaged in understanding of more than 4,000 of these serial predators. This man understands what's happening. He said the favorite phrase is, well, I know what it looks like, but it's not really that, for this Drag Queen Story Hour. And he says, so now they've spun it. And what we're hearing from these guys is 100%
I love
a lie.
This quote. Euler calls the push to foment confusion in the minds of children. I said that. You and I said that for months now, that this is really about undermining gender. It's not about teaching them tolerance of anything. But Euler calls this push to foment confusion in the minds of children and break down their boundaries. He calls it a moral Ebola virus that is spreading rapidly through the society. That is remarkable.
Yeah, he says we cannot afford to do nothing because we have very darkened and deviant individuals that are predators going after our kids, and they are expanding. To not do anything is to hand our kids over to them.
Yeah, and you see how close we are to when these kids then do get raped, when these kids are preyed upon. We're starting to hear from the more radical fringe activists with regards to pedophilia. Well, these kids we've sexualized these. Who is it that sexualized these kids? It's not the drag queens. It's the library staff who are hosting them. It's the parents who bring them. It's the public schools, as we've seen time after time after time, more and more and more, younger and younger and younger, sexualizing little children. And then eventually when little children like this find themselves at the sexual mercies of these adult perverts, how soon is it going to be before, well, this was a consensual, Colorado is trying to pass a bill right now that would argue that any child of any age who consents to a sex act is therefore committing a perfectly healthy sex act.
Just because mom and dad are going to say, well, I would never take my kid to that, so it's all going to be okay. Here's the issue, and what Euler points out, I think people really need to wise up to this, is the fact that if in your community you have these events and you say, okay, I'm not going to them, it's still dangerous, because what he says is predators are using these drag queen story hours as a test to find out the degree of resolve of that community. So you may think that it's just happening within the libraries and your community is still safe, but these predators, he says, and if it's easy pickings, trust me, predators are going to begin to flock to that community. So what can you do, mom and dad? It's not just sitting there and picketing outside, he says, to have them canceled. You have to go to the actual source. Who funds the library? Who is the one who is actually making the decisions? And you have to actually go to the event and tape it and expose it for what it is.
One quick final comment from me is this is the equivalent, not on the same moral level, but this is equivalent, mom and dad. If you're a homeschool mom and dad, got your kids in private schools, and you say to yourself, my kids aren't public school kids, I don't have to worry about this. We've already seen in Oregon and California. California is now telling every charter and voucher school, you will teach the sexuality we teach. In some cases, state of New York is on the verge of trying to pass a piece of legislation that would require every home school and private school in the state of New York to adopt the same substantial standards when it comes to everything, including sexuality, that the public schools are doing. So you cannot stay on the sideline anymore. You've got to get involved in this.
Absolutely. All right, now let's go to Colorado since you teased that one out. What's happening in Colorado right now?
Colorado teachers asked to take white privilege survey. And now this isn't unusual in itself, but it's good to whenever we get examples like this where we can prove it to you, show you. This, on the one hand, we are 100% tolerant of drag queens with sexual histories, illegal sexual histories. We got people out there defending them. On the other hand, you have institutionalized racism masquerading as white privilege surveys. This is nothing more than denigrating an entire race of people, and particularly an entire sex and race of people. And Joe Biden just came out today and said racism, institutional racism, is a white man's problem. Well, Chucky, as the guy who basically said you can't walk into a 7-Eleven in Delaware without seeing an Indian Apu, maybe you ought to start with yourself. It's always funny. The Beto O'Rourkes and the Joe Bidens of the world, they never politically abort themselves for their sins, right? Elect me because I'm the whitest white man who knows it's a problem. And what you're asking Colorado teachers to do here is really pretty shocking. Teachers at Colorado's Cherry Creek School District have been presented with a white privilege survey in an effort to make sure they treat racial minority students well. And that's it. To treat racial minority students well in the public schools is to attack non-racial minorities. There's no other way to do it. You can't equalize them. You can't be fair to both of them. The only way to be racially fair now in American public schools is to attack whiteness and white students.
And the reason that we even have a clue as to what's happening with this survey that they handed out was an anonymous teacher actually sent it to PGA Media, who presented this article, and the Cherry Creek schools did verify its authenticity. But, of course, they said the survey was not mandatory.
Not mandatory for who? You are the pasty white Colorado third grade teacher who says, I'm not taking your white supremacy paper, your white privilege. I'm not taking it. What do you think is going to happen? That right there, by definition, means that you are sufficiently unwoke, and that by not be, you are free to choose, but your unwillingness to acknowledge your own white privilege makes us question whether we should continue to employ you.
And of course, this survey wasn't just, okay, hand it out, in your own classroom, do this at your own time if you choose. This was done with everyone in a group, Barney circles. I
bet you there's not a single... How could you refuse to do this? If you're white, how can you refuse to do this? Again, it's not something that's mailed to your classroom. You can do it over email in a big circle with everybody watching.
So there were, 26 different statements for them and their partners before... They were supposed to do this before and after the racial awareness training finger snaps that they did.
Wait, was, so was the racial training mandatory?
That's a good question.
See, I bet you it was. So you have to attend the racial training, but you're somehow going to opt out of the white supremacy survey. This is Orwellian. This is fascism, and it uses the language of fascism. It hijacks the language of freedom and choice, all the well knowing that yes, comrade, moose and squirrel time. Yes, comrade, you cannot take the test. But this bullet is for you. You get the test or the bullet. Which will you choose?
Within the survey of the 26, a couple your favorites, I guess you included here. The survey may ask, when I am told about our national heritage or about, quote, civilization, I am shown that people of my race made it what it is.
Well, let's take a look at the history of Western culture. Since you, not me, progressives, you insist on seeing everybody who's not dark-skinned as white. Right? So I get you're the ones who've decided that Romans were white guys. You're the ones who decided that medieval Christians were white guys. You're the ones that decide that Swedes and Italians and Spaniards are all white guys. You're the ones who think that Russians in the 19th century are white guys and Finns in the 13th century are white guys. Okay, fine. If that entire collection of Western history, if you liberals call them white guys, then you've answered your own question.
And I'll read another one. It says, I can go into most supermarkets and find the staple foods which fit with my racial ethnic traditions. I can go into any hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair. Now, number one, how many people are going to the most supermarkets to find staple foods? No one cooks in America anymore, period. So let's just go off on that tangent.
I've been to grocery stores. There are all kinds of ethnic. And by the way, are bananas American food? I mean, no, they're not. I mean, how many things can you list? Most species of fish aren't American food.
How about avocados?
Avocados
Where did those originate?
Aren't American food, and you're avocado toast. This idea that there is somehow white guy food is ridiculous. In fact, I would argue that there is more non-white guy food, and there have been for 50 years. This idea that somehow, and the insulting idea that when non-Western people eat American food, they're somehow engaging in a racially transgressive act. This idea, and the haircut stuff. First of all, I am 100% convinced that people get their degrees in barbering now, and they're exposed to all different kinds of hair. The idea that you're going to prepare people to cut hair who can only cut the hair of 18% or 20% or 60% of Americans is stupid. It doesn't make the least little bit of sense. And by the way, why is it necessarily a problem that there are black barbers and black barber shops in black neighborhoods? That no one's bothered by that, but you got white people cutting white hair in white neighborhoods is now a problem.
And the poor gingers get nothing.
There you go.
But if you would take all the statements, and you can do this on your own time, we don't have time to do it, but if you would take all these statements and have university professors read them or any of our politicians read them, it would reveal just who is actually the one with the white privilege as they claim.
Yeah, I want to close with this quote at the end of the article. Classes on white privilege are counterproductive. A recent study found that such classes do not make either liberals or conservatives more sympathetic to the plight of black people. But they do make liberals less empathetic towards poor rights. So all of this garbage you're doing with this, it doesn't make conservatives or liberals more sensitive to black people. It doesn't. But it makes liberals hate white as if they need another reason to hate poor white people more than they already do.
All right, well, let's give you some real education because Colorado teachers are not going to be giving it to you. And this week, courtesy of our award-winning Presidential Minute series, we're going to deliver the highlights from our nation's fourth president. Yes, the father of the Constitution himself, Mr. James Madison. Roll it.
Let me tell you a little story about a man named James Madison. Born in Virginia on March 16, 1751, he would be known as the father of the Constitution. Madison graduated from what is now Princeton University. 24 years later, he married Dolly Payne Todd and together raised one child. Considered one of America's founding fathers, Madison penned the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, and much of the Federalist Papers. He also came up with the concept for the three branches of government we still use today. Madison was the nation's 5th Secretary of State and 4th President, making him the first president to serve in Congress. He supervised the Louisiana Purchase, Embargo Act of 1807, War of 1812, and helped form a political party. Today, Madison's name lives on, including 2 Navy ships, the capital of Wisconsin, and the $5,000 bill. On June 28, 1836, James Madison died at his family's estate in Virginia. The 85-year-old was the last living founding father. And there you go, a little story about a man named James.
Oakley dokley, don't you feel smarter now? Well, show us some love by sharing this episode and subscribe to the free audio podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and everywhere else. Just visit drdukeshow.com, click on any of the platforms on the top of the screen. Please, please, please subscribe. Remember, it's free.
And that does it for us this week. We're off on Monday for Labor Day. I never understood that. We celebrate labor by not working. So we'll see you Tuesday with much more talk about the world of education. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. And remember, stay educated, my friend.